I'm actually going to do a little bit of a PowerPoint lesson today. So I'm going to knock down the lights to video setting here. For those of you really tired, this is your moment. I'm going to get these down, and you can double-click the slideshow if you would for me. There it is. So I've given this lesson a lot to our confirmands. The challenge is, though, is it's about a 45-minute lesson, and I don't really want to keep you here that long. So there might be some unpolished parts of this as I cruise through it, because my plan was to get here really early this morning and shave it down to an acceptable amount of time for all of you in your human lives. But about Friday at 3 p.m., I remembered that Margaret's gone for the weekend, and I had to bring my kids to church this morning. So it remains the director's cut. So I am going to do my best to move through it in a respectable amount of time, but hopefully you find it worth your while because, again, this is the lesson we give for our confirmands because they have a 2-year curriculum. Our 7th graders and 8th graders rotate a curriculum from the year of the Bible to the year of Lutheranism. In the year of the Bible, they cover Genesis to Revelation, and we do our best to kind of understand the main trajectory and narrative of Scripture. And then the year of Lutheranism, we learn about why are we this flavor of Christianity? What ingredients go into being Lutheran? You know, we are not the only flavor of Christianity, but we're a flavor with certain particularities and emphases. And so we spend a year learning about some of those particular theologies that we have that make up our flavor of the big, beautiful Christian church. So with that, we're going to learn about Martin Luther today, also because it's Reformation Sunday. And Time Magazine, I don't remember exactly when, but Time Magazine, somewhere in, I think, the mid-2010s, came out with 100 most influential and impactful historical figures in global history, which, I mean, that in and of itself, Time Magazine, what a task. Martin Luther, according to Time Magazine, was ranked number 17th. And not only is this the founding father of our flavor of Christianity, he's a monumental historical figure. He changed the landscape of Europe, not through just his theological and ecclesial movements or church movements, but he was also, he was a scholar of the Old Testament, but he was a political philosopher as well. Everyone from Martin Luther King Jr. to even Karl Marx have quoted Luther on his economic and political theories as well. And I also want to acknowledge that a lot of us Lutherans don't know a lot about Martin Luther, and that's okay, all right? Like, for instance, I start every confirmation year of Lutheranism off by saying, by a show of hands. And of course, I get a little chuckle out of it, but at the same time, I'm not trying to make fun of our 12 through 14-year-olds here, but I go, by a show of hands, when I say First Lutheran Church and that we are named after Martin Luther, how many of you confirmands think I'm talking about Martin Luther King Jr.? And a third of them raise their hands. Almost every year. And the other 2/3, they might go, I know it's not that Martin Luther, but we don't know who this Martin Luther is either. So we spend some time learning the history and biography of Martin Luther, and that's what we're going to do today. Like, what is it about this guy? Who is this guy? We got big questions today. First, who is Martin Luther? What's his biography? And finally, what does it even mean to be Lutheran, to continue to follow in this Reformation tradition that we'll talk about here in a moment. So first, though, what can help balance us out with this, or lead us into this lesson, is just some main vocabulary. And first, I'm going to come right out and say it. Here's who Martin Luther was in a paragraph. He was a German monk who worked to make changes in the church during the 16th century and became known as the founder of a new movement that became the Lutheran Church. And he ignited a massive period in European history known as the era of the Reformation. Luther was not the only reformer. There were multiple reformers and Protestants. He was just a main reformer and an early reformer. What you have to remember is all of Europe at this time in the 1500s was Roman Catholic, the Holy Roman Empire. And so Luther, a Catholic, saw a couple of theologies and practices that he wanted to protest, to say the least. And he didn't want to actually start a new church. He wanted to reform the Catholic Church. He found institutional unity important. He didn't want to start a new movement. But nevertheless, this time period of the 16th century where he and other reformers are trying to change the Catholic Church, the medieval Roman Catholic Church is known as the Reformation. And I really stress the word medieval Catholic Church. Lutherans, especially since like the 1960s and 1980s, we are in a joint declaration of faith with the Roman Catholic Church. We have a lot of agreement now. So my point, when you hear a lot of critique of Roman Catholic theology today, don't judge the modern Roman Catholic Church today by the medieval Roman Catholic Church. This was a darker, more corrupt moment of their history. I had a religion professor, a Luther scholar named Mark Tranvik, who said, I remember him going on this note, he goes, like for instance, the popes during this time period, he goes, these Renaissance Reformation popes, that's the stuff HBO series are made out of today. Like these guys are about as corrupt as they could be. So again, any critique you hear of Roman Catholicism today through Martin Luther and through me is really levied at the medieval Catholic Church, okay? Because they've made a bunch of reforms since this as well. And finally, another key word you should know is theology. We have a ton of ways of thinking about God, and that's known as theology. And Lutheran theology is a particular way of understanding and experiencing God. It's a way of, theo in Greek means God, and logi means logic or study of, right? So, other key words, indulgences. This is a big one. If you understand this medieval Roman Catholic practice, you understand what Luther was out to dismantle. You understand the basic theologies he was trying to deconstruct and reform. Because indulgences were real simple. I mean, they weren't this simple, but I'm going to simplify it. They're money paid for the forgiveness of sin. And it represents the whole medieval Catholic theology at the time. And so here's how it would go, is Emma would come to me, I'm the village Catholic priest, and I'd say, Emma, tell me about your week in confession. She confesses X, Y, and Z, and I go, okay, that'll be 10 Hail Marys, and we should also think about your grandmother in purgatory, and you should probably pay some indulgences to make sure that she's released and that you're forgiven. There's a transactional theology, and there's a real fancy terminology here known as merit-based salvation. This is what Luther was up against and trying to challenge. By your merits, you are saved by God. By your gold stars, by your good works. This was the medieval Roman Catholic theology at the time. A transactional understanding of how we are accepted by God. Do X, Y, and Z, believe A, B, and C, and you will earn God's love and salvation. That system is what Luther set out to rid. And a major merit-based salvation was indulgences. And he started off by nailing 95 theses, or a thesis is a statement made to provoke an argument. And he nailed in 1517 on Halloween, October 31st, 1517, he nailed 95 arguments against the sale of indulgences or merit-based salvation to start a firestorm of conversation. And he went viral, so to speak. You also need to know that Luther at this time was, technological advances were on his side. The printing press had been invented in the late 1400s, so people were able to spread information like no other time in history. So Luther's 95 theses against the Roman Catholic Church's practices of indulgences went viral. And there's all this chatter after that. All right? So the big question, though, who is Martin Luther? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on his early life, but he was born in 1483 in Germany. He was born to German peasants. You see Hans and Marguerite there and their paintings. He was born to, again, lower middle class peasantry. His father worked in the mines in Germany. And by 1505, Luther was an unbelievable student and already an intellectual. He was 22 years old and he was entering law school. And his family really saw this as kind of their cash cow. He can get out and start to build some wealth and raise their social status. And he's going to law school. The family's totally in support of it. But he has what's called this thunderstorm experience. He's on a horse heading back to school after a break, and a thunderstorm rolls into the Black Forest of Germany there and terrifies the horse. He gets bucked off, lightning's crashing, and he, pre-scientific days here, so he runs under a tree, not knowing what else to do, and he prays to the saint, the patron saint of miners, because again, his dad worked in the mines. He prays to Saint Anne, and he prays to Saint Anne, please spare my life. If you spare my life, I will exit law school and I will give my life to the church. I will enter the monastery. Of course, Luther survives. He enters the Augustinian order, named after St. Augustine from the 3rd or 4th century. And he enters the monastery. And again, the whole of Holy Roman Catholicism at this time is dominated by this merit-based salvation. And he's learning about how hard it is to earn God's favor and how much we should fear God's wrath. And he has, over time, after studying a God like this, and studying sort of this toxic theology, he has a spiritual crisis. He begins to go neurotic. He begins to go mad. And he starts confessing every dirty thought or invasive thought. He starts confessing every little wrong that he does. He spends hours in prayer and cleaning and chores because he thinks he's got to earn his way out of divine punishment, right? And he starts to go absolutely bonkers. In fact, a little comedic relief here, there's even evidence that Luther was so tormented by this merit-based theology that I got to earn it, I got to stay righteous for God, that he would even confess his own flatulence. And if you don't know what flatulence is, Google that, all right? So he's tormented by this merit-based theology, and he even begins to hate God for it. He's like, how could you expect this of us? That we have to become perfect and perfectly righteous in order to be embraced by you, and yet we can't possibly do it all. This seems like an unfair, rigged game. And finally, there's a mentor by the name of Johann von Staupitz who says, Luther, I think you and I think we are thinking of this backwards. What if Christ is not a punisher, but is actually a savior? I think we need to read more of the scriptures in the New Testament, particularly Paul, and they start to develop this grace-based salvation. That is, what if we looked at the cross for understanding who God is and how far God would go in order to love us? What if it's not by our works that we're saved and loved and accepted by God, but it's through Christ's work? What if that's what's actually the theology that we should be understanding? And Johann von Staupitz says, you can find this theology in the New Testament, in particular Luther, and he turns them on to, and again, the Bible's not widely accessible, so he turns them on to Paul's letter to the Romans, Paul's letter to the Galatians, the Ephesians that we heard Janet read today, that basically undermines this merit-based theology. Finds out by reading scriptures that no, we don't have to earn it. This merit-based, you've got to earn your way out of God's damnation, is actually a bogus theology, and it's all right here. For instance, in Romans it says all fall short of the glory of God. Every last one of us is imperfect, so why would perfection be the expectation? None of us could ever save ourselves. In fact, therefore, our salvation must be by grace alone. It's a free gift. Not something we earn through gold stars and our own merits. In Galatians, Paul says the same thing. Paul says, for freedom, Christ has set you free. If you had to earn it yourself, what was even the point of Jesus? Paul says in Galatians, maybe this religion isn't a tormenting religion where we spend our lives trying to impress some temperamental God. Maybe this God is gracious and loves us already and sets us free to live lives of joy and service to the neighbor. And that's where, again, he goes in Ephesians. Nobody earns the love of God. It's a free gift. And in response to that free gift, we should love our neighbor. So in the meantime, Luther starts writing more and challenging, and he gets really spicy in his challenges of the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. He's a pretty vulgar guy. He's searingly smart and brilliant, and he does not hold back in his insults and eviscerations of the church. And he mainly keys in on their corruption and this practice of indulgences. And he just keeps writing and lecturing more and more. Eventually, Luther gets his doctorate in the Old Testament, becomes a professor. And he is lighting up the church and their corruption and their merit-based practices. And again, in 1517, he posts this 95 Theses against indulgences on a Wittenberg church door, and kind of a firestorm sets off across Europe. He's sowing doubt in the dominant theologies of the time. And then he writes 3 landmark treatises. One's called To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, and one's called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And in those 2, he absolutely lights up the medieval Roman Catholic Church. Calls the Pope the Antichrist in one of them. And he starts to dismantle the sacramental system. It's the reason why we Lutherans only have 2 sacraments, which we'll have today, baptism and Holy Communion, because Luther says the other 5 because the Catholic Church has 7. They have no biblical precedent. Why are we being required to do all this? And if you read those, great. But the one that changed my life of the 3 treatises was A Freedom of a Christian. Freedom of a Christian is where Luther basically summarizes the entire Lutheran Reformed theology that he has. And I remember reading it as required reading for a religion major at Augsburg, and I remember thinking, and I was pretty agnostic at the time, I didn't care about church all that much. I remember reading and going, maybe this religion isn't awful because of that writing. And it's pretty accessible, it's pretty short. Freedom of a Christian, 1520. And again, these things are being widely circulated, and guess what? The Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire does not like it. So they excommunicate him, they kick him out, meaning you're out of the church, you no longer can receive the sacraments. So now Luther's hope for reforming the church is basically over, because he's kicked out. So he's got to start his own movement. This doesn't hold him back. He keeps writing. This guy wrote more than anybody in Europe at the time. But because he was from the Northern Europe, and Northern Europeans didn't love being Catholic, or at least Holy Roman Empire, very much anyway. They're kind of the last territories to be conquered by the empire, and they didn't like being a part of it. So Luther sort of becomes sort of a populist rock star. The people in Northern Europe love him. They're like, yeah, this guy's fighting for us. He's calling out the oppressor. We love this guy. And fearing populist rage and backlash, the Roman Empire is like, fine, we'll at least give you a trial. We'll at least give you a trial. And that trial is known as the Diet of Worms. Reads as Diet of Worms, but this is in Germany. At first he's doing Rome, and then they're like, no, by Roman law, he gets to have a trial in his own territory. So Worms is in Germany, and he has this trial. And this is one of my favorite parts of his whole story. So he's set for his trial, and everyone's kind of happy. They're like, hey, at least you're going to get a trial. And he is so mad. He's like this stubborn, egotistical guy. And I think he kind of had to be. He's so mad that he even has to go to his trial. He complains. He's like, I got work to do. I'm studying the Psalms. I'm doing daily prayers. I'm leading classes. I'm preparing sermons, and I got to go to this thing. He's so mad about it. And he enters into Worms, though, and he recalls it as his Palm Sunday. Because, again, the people love him. They're lining the streets, apparently. And they're cheering for him because he's challenging the man, right? But he calls it his Palm Sunday, which is actually kind of ominous, right? Because what happens at the end of Palm Sunday and Holy Week? Luther sees the writing on the wall. He's up against the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire. And he walks down to the site of his trial. And he walks into the building, and there's dozens of cardinals and papal agents. The big hitters of Roman Catholic authority are all there. In fact, even Charles V is there, the Emperor of Rome, the heir to a 1,000-year-old empire is there. They're trying to intimidate Luther and everyone who follows him. This is how we respond to dissidents. You don't just mess with the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church. And they have 2 questions for him, and I'm simplifying this. It's a multi-day event. But on a table, they stack up a bunch of his writings where he called out the Catholic Church at the time and the empire. And they have 2 questions for him. They go, A, did you write these? And B, do you take them back? Do you recant? And this is where I love Luther. This is so bold and so arrogant, I couldn't even imagine. In front of all these people, they go, did you write these, this stack of writings? And Luther goes, yeah, I wrote those, and I wrote even more. You don't even have them all. And then famously, will you recant? And I want to get this right. He famously says, now will I recant unless I can be instructed and convinced with evidence from the Holy Scriptures. My conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. So he seals his fate, stares the empire and the Roman Catholic Church in the face and says, yep, I wrote all those, I wrote even more, and I don't take any of it back. Seals his fate. He knows it's over. He's due back, I think, in Rome for sentencing. And as he's leaving Worms after the trial, he's declared an outlaw of the state, and he's kidnapped. Can you imagine what he's feeling? Bag thrown over his head. They're not even going to give me a sentencing hearing. It's over. He's kidnapped. And we find out that it wasn't the Roman Empire that kidnapped him. It was his elector, his prince, Frederick the Wise, who was like, I'm not about to lose the support of my people. I'm going to protect Luther because he is my rock star and my people will love me for it. So Frederick the Wise kidnaps him, keeps him in hiding at a castle called Wartburg. We have an ELCA college and seminary in Iowa known as Wartburg. And he says, you hide out here and you keep writing. You keep writing and I'll pump it out. And so he starts translating the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into German. He wants to get it into the language of the people. And he says, read it for yourselves. See that this merit-based theology that you have to earn it is bogus. And he translates the Bible into German. And meanwhile, he's protected by his popularity and German leadership. And that's how he's able to sustain this movement and not get burned at the stake. And he keeps writing more and more and more. Famously, he writes the Small Catechism and the Large Catechism in 1529. The Small Catechism is for the people in their homes. Here, I'll summarize the basics of the faith. You learn it and you keep it here at home. And then for large catechisms, he pumps that out and says, here, pastors, take this. This is the grace-based theology to preach and teach your people. And so he writes those two and he starts this movement pretty organized, right? And then meanwhile, all these people that join his movement, scholars and religious figures, join this Lutheran Protestant movement and they figure out, you know what, the church isn't going to reform. We're going to have to start our own thing. And they write their constitutional documents of what they believe. And they're known as the Augsburg Confession. And they're written in 1530. And again, Lutheran College down in Minneapolis that I went to, Augsburg University, named after this moment. Lutheranism is organized and it takes off throughout Northern Europe. And Luther dies eventually in 1546. And I'm taking so much of your time that I'm going to speed this up. So what does it mean, based on this guy's life's work and the movement he started, that we continue 5 centuries plus later? Here's the basic Lutheran theology. If you understand this, you understand all of Lutheranism. We are saved by grace, not by the right belief, not by our good works. We are saved by Jesus. It's a free gift. And not only that, that frees us finally to truly love our neighbor. For instance, in a merit-based salvation metric, if we had to do good works in order to earn our way into God's acceptance, is that really all that loving when we love our neighbor when we're doing it to earn salvation? In other words, if Lori gets sick and I go over there and rake her leaves and take out her trash and all those things, but I'm doing it in order to get into heaven, am I really loving Lori or am I loving me? Right? And Luther is saying, what if you're saved already and you can truly love your neighbor? You're good. Now go actually truly love your neighbor. And so there's a lot of words here, but I'm going to skip it. I just want you to focus on that T in the middle. It makes a cross. Here's a lasting imagery that summarizes Lutheran theology. I tell the confirmands this. Think of the cross. The vertical relationship, if you indulge me, although God is everywhere, between you and God, the vertical relationship is good. Jesus has solved it. You do not have to worry about your relationship with God. You are made right and accepted already. Now you can focus outside of yourselves into the freedom and joy of life and focus horizontally on your neighbor. That is Lutheran theology. Let's see how I did. Ready for the quiz show? The Reformation took place in what century? 1 for 1. Good. Well done. This one's a little weirder because I think of the way I phrased it. The era during the Reformation and also preceding it was known as the blank era. Starts with an M. Nice. Martin Luther taught that believers are saved by blank through faith. Grace. That was the most confident? Good. That's the only one you really needed to know. All right. Martin Luther was born, lived, and died in this country. Good job. Martin Luther and others who worked to change practices of the Roman Catholic Church at the time were called, I'll accept 2 answers. Protestants, reformers? Oh my gosh, you nailed it. Good job. And Martin Luther translated the Bible from its original languages into? Good job. And the Diet of Worms was a trial. Good. That's where he famously stated, here I stand, I can do no other. And that, oh my gosh, I took so much time. We better get singing. Worship team, get up there. Amen. All right. As the worship team